NATO's Secretary General is making it clear that allies will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, as the war now nears the one-year mark. Jens Stoltenberg's comments came as the NATO defense ministers met in Brussels. Also in attendance, Ukraine's defense minister, who says Russia is the most significant and direct threat to NATO countries, and that Ukrainian soldiers are defending all of Europe. NATO's chief reaffirmed the commitment to helping Ukraine.
NATO allies are providing unprecedented support to Ukraine to help uphold its right of self-defense. And from the start, we have been working very closely with the European Union, determined to support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Ukrainian forces are now locked in fierce fighting on the front lines in the east, where Ukraine says Russian troops are continuing offensives from the air and on the ground in the Donetsk region. Bakhmut is among the cities that's been targeted by Russian attacks. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says his soldiers are facing a tough fight.
The situation on the front line, especially in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, remains extremely difficult. It is literally a battle for every meter of Ukrainian land. We must understand the significance of these battles. Every meter won is to defend our entire country.
CNN's David McKenzie is following developments and has more on the battle raging between Ukraine and Russia on the front lines.
Thousands of miles from the front lines, a cemetery in Russia's Far East, for young men cut down in relentless waves of attack. Off camera, a woman sobs and says, "Our boys." Soldiers of the 155th Marine Brigade, their unit has taken catastrophic losses in Vuhledar. For weeks, the coal mining town, the epicenter of Russia's efforts to break through Ukrainian lines. But the assault here has been a disaster. At least 30 Russian tanks destroyed by Ukrainian mines and artillery, a scrambled, chaotic retreat. Across this front, the Ukrainians are well dug in. Their lines aren't moving. But this soldier says there are now 10 attacks a day. There used to be just a couple. To the north, the Russians are inching forward around Bakhmut, and every exit from the city is extremely dangerous. The battle's here at close quarters, unrelenting trench warfare on the edge of the city. It's so hard the enemy is pushing from different directions, says this Ukrainian soldier. All the efforts our men are making are priceless. Fighters of the Wagner mercenary group paraded their flag at a village on the outskirts of Bakhmut, but they are being forced to fight for every single house. And Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin admits Bakhmut will not be taken tomorrow because there is heavy resistance and grinding. For the meat grinder to work properly, it is impossible to suddenly start festivities. This as Wagner units continue to endure heavy losses in its efforts on the hills around Bakhmut, where they are vulnerable to Ukrainian artillery and drones. Ukrainian officials now expect another Russian thrust further north in the forest near Crimea. There's been fierce fighting here for weeks. A Russian advance here would allow the Kremlin to claim it's captured all of Luhansk region, a key objective of Vladimir Putin's war. But the Ukrainians are putting up stiff resistance, and their allies expect that in the spring they may be able to launch attacks of their own if they are supplied the weapons and ammunition they need.
We believe that there will be a window of opportunity for them to exercise initiative and then change or continue to create the right conditions on the battlefield there.
Before that, along this vast front, the Ukrainians must hold off what they expect to be an imminent Russian onslaught. David McKenzie, CNN, Kyiv.
Joining us from Washington is David Sanger. He is a CNN political and national security analyst, as well as a White House correspondent for the New York Times, and joins us now from D.C. Good to see you, David.
Great to be back with you, Lynn.
So the West is continuing to promise to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Looking at the way this war has unfolded, how long could that be?
Well, it could be years. It depends on whether or not either the counteroffensive that the Ukrainians are hoping for or this offensive that appears to have begun, at least at a low to medium level by the Russians, actually results in a significant change on the ground. If it doesn't, if we're in for the long slog, then the Russians and the Ukrainians will be battling over the south and the east, and the Russians will be looking for a moment where they could revive their hopes of taking the whole country. We think that's a reach too far for them right now. So the question is, does this become a somewhat frozen conflict, an accelerated version of what happened after the invasion of Crimea in 2014 and of the south and the east of Ukraine shortly thereafter? Or does this become a sort of all-out conflict in which the Russians go beyond Ukraine's borders and take on NATO nations? So far, they've shown no interest in doing so.
I want to ask you, David, about the weapons. The Ukrainian President Zelensky has made it clear that speed is key, not just shipping weapons, but also training troops, given this anticipated spring offensive. But there are big problems. Much of what has been promised in recent weeks, the armoured tanks, the longer range missiles, some of which haven't even been built yet. How big a problem is that in terms of getting those weapons that have been promised into the hands of fighters on the front line?
Well, there is an increasing mismatch, Linda, between Western promises and what we're able to deliver. You know, in the early days of the war, when the Ukrainians mostly needed anti-aircraft and very light weapons, javelins, portable airplane and tank killers, there were a fair number of those around. They were in storage. They could be handed to the Ukrainians pretty quickly. We're in a very different situation now. The war has moved to what is essentially more of an artillery conflict in the flatlands of the south and the east. They've run through a huge amount of ammunition, and it's clearly not possible right now for the United States to continue to keep up. The easy stores of older weapons have been exhausted, and so now the U.S., when it promises weapons, is basically putting them on order in the factory. That's what they did with the Abrams tanks. And that means it could be months, could be more than a year before they get delivered. And what you're hearing from Zelensky, President Zelensky, is he's saying, hey, look, I don't have a year. I don't even have 3 months. I need the weapons now because they're starting their counteroffensive or hope to soon.
And high on the wish list for Zelensky is fighter jets. And so far, Ukrainian pilots are receiving training in Britain, but even if those fighter jets are promised, that won't happen quickly. Why is there this reluctance, David, to offer those?
The reluctance on President Biden's part comes from the fact that those jets can reach well into Russia. They could bomb Moscow, and while the Ukrainians say that is not their intent, this is the way the war could escalate quite rapidly and turn into a U.S.-Russia war or a NATO-Russia war. And consistently, you have heard President Biden offer two different objectives here. One is, he says, we'll support the Ukrainians. The second is, he says, we will not get into World War III. Well, Putin's sensed the vulnerability that second criteria creates, and that's why episodically you hear him threaten to use nuclear weapons and so forth. He's clearly trying to say to Biden, there are some parameters here, and if the Ukrainians are going after Crimea, which of course Russia seized in 2014, if they are going after Moscow, if they're going after Russian infrastructure, that would be what would trigger a larger war.
Yeah, that is a major concern. David Sanger, always good to get your perspective. Thanks so much for your time tonight.
Great to be with you.